Here we are on Chapter 2, Legal Considerations in Appraisal. Well, our objectives in this chapter are learn something about physical and the legal characteristics of real estate, talk about use restrictions, property descriptions, and real estate contracts, which we'll spend just a short amount of time on, as you're going to get a lot of that in real estate law. Next slide, please. Well, your student learning outcomes are pretty well defined in the textbook at the beginning of the chapter. We'll want you to be able to define real estate, real property, and personal property, and give examples and describe their differences, which I will do for you. Define and give examples of the bundle of rights. Most of you should have had principles prior to this and know a little bit about the bundle of rights already. And you should be able to explain and provide examples of the three broad categories of restrictions on the use of real property. Next slide, please. Well, this is student learning outcomes continued. You should be able to define the four governmental restrictions on the private ownership of all property, list and provide examples of the major types of legal descriptions, and list and explain the 5 requirements for a valid contract. Next slide, please. Well, the physical and legal characteristics of real estate. Property consists of rights that have value, valuable rights held to the exclusion of others. We often call it real estate, but what we're really valuing as appraisers is real estate rights. The example is, of course, of the value is the right to occupy and enjoy your home, and that is a very valuable right, and it's ensconced in law and is recognized throughout the United States. Next slide, please. Let's talk about property classifications here in this slide. We're talking about the 2 types of property, the tangible property, rights to physical objects, and that can be real estate property with improvements on it. That's tangible, you can touch it. It could be machinery, it can be equipment, it can be jewelry, it can be anything that you can touch and has a physical presence is called tangible property. There's also things that we deal with as appraisers called intangible property, and these are the rights to non-physical things. The examples here in the little clip art is a lease, a copyright, and a registered trademark. These are non-physical things, but they can have value to people, and they can be appraised quite easily by those who have the proper education. Most of the time, real estate appraisers deal with leases. A lease is a contract between a landlord and a tenant. Usually, we're going to try to keep it simple in this class. And of course, there'll be a start, and there'll be an end, and there will be a remuneration or amount of money stated in the lease. And then from then on, it can be almost anything. You can buy simple leases off the internet. You can go to, well, if you can find, maybe Staples will still have some printed leases. I've seen rental property leases for a house for 2 or 3 pages. I've also seen properties that have leases that go on for maybe 115, 120 pages. All of these types of leases, from the very small to the very large, have to be taken into consideration. And very often when leases, not very often, but often, most of the time, when leases are attached to real estate and they're over 2 or 3 years, they're going to have a very large effect on the value of the property that is the subject of the lease. Copyrights and registered trademarks are not usually appraised by real estate appraisers for obvious reasons, but there are people, usually business value appraisers, that deal with copyrights and registered trademarks, and sometimes if you're doing a large estate or something where copyrights and registered trademarks have value to that estate, then you'll have to, under the competency law, either be competent to appraise the copyrights and the registered trademarks, or since most real estate appraisers don't deal with that, you would engage the services of an appraiser that was qualified to appraise these types of properties. Let's split this up a little bit more and go to the next slide. Well, we can take types of tangible property and we can split it into real property and into personal property. Real property is defined as the land and everything attached to it, and that's a pretty basic definition. Lawyers and legals could probably make that a little longer definition, but for this class, real property is land and everything attached to it, and it's also called real estate. Personal property is anything that is movable and all that is not real property, and that takes a pretty big swath of property types. Anything that is movable. One of the things that comes up in residential real estate in high-end homes is that very often people will have extremely expensive chandeliers, not quite like the light fixture shown here on this clip art, but when you are appraising that property or you're making a listing for it, you need to know whether that chandelier is cut glass or precious stones. Makes a big difference in the value. The second thing you need to know is this chandelier going to stay? Is it a centerpiece of this person's idea of how a foyer or an entrance should look? Or is it going to stay with the house and going to be included in the value of the house? That could be movable quite easily. And generally, when you write up a contract, or if you have the opportunity to work in areas that have these types of homes, your broker will indicate to you how you should write these up, because it's going to make a big difference. Some of these chandeliers can go into the millions. There are other fixtures that may come out of a house that are movable, and so this becomes an important consideration. In general, middle-class homes in the, well, for California, most of the stuff less than $1 million, you're not going to have any type of these personal property that can be moved, so it's not a consideration, but just be aware of it. And all that's not real property. I swear to you, I did not put this airplane in. It was put in by somebody else on the online on-course learning. I have used it in my own slides, and I don't want to bore you too much with it, but airplane appraisers are good detectives. It's a little easier in some ways and a little harder in others. Most of you probably don't know that aircraft, especially small personal aircraft, have logbooks, and one of the first things an appraiser does, just like you, when you go to look at your house and inspect your house, the appraiser of an aircraft wants to go look at the aircraft and then read the logbooks, both for the airframe, the engine, and the propeller, to see how they've been maintained over the years. And that is starting of the appraisal problem for aircraft. Enough of that anyway. Let's go to the next slide, please. Well, let's talk about the components of real property. First, of course, is the land. Secondly is the permanently affixed objects to the land. 3, appurtenant rights. And of course, that which is immovable by law. These components define real property and real estate and are found in figure 2.2. Let's take a look at that. Figure 2.1 shows the definition of real estate. It shows the land, shows the house, it shows the definition of real estate. I'm sorry. Shows that the trees and things that are on the land. are fixed to the land, and then there's things that are pertinent to the land, and those things that are movable by law. Okay, let's take a look at this. There are some things here that we're not really sure of and are in general use. Of course, everybody knows where the land is, and everybody knows where the house is, and maybe some trees and some other things which are attached to the land permanently. An appurtenance, take a look on page 21, you'll find that an appurtenant right, there's three of them. When you have certain rights, certain sites of land that have the benefits of natural features, lakes, ocean, that extend beyond the property, there can be appurtenant rights on the land that say that nobody can block that particular view. And so this gets into court very often when there's building on along the coast of California, up in the mountains where there are lake views, and or whether they're just other views of natural beauty. So these are appurtenant rights. Secondly, an easement across the property can be given to somebody else for the right of passage without the right of ownership, and this is a pertinent right. Third, and one that's not quite as common, is when you have a community water, for instance, water company, and they may have rights and company stock and so on that are appurtenant rights. And these are not as common, but you have to keep a look for them. And brokers usually are the ones who know the property and know these type of rights exist. And of course, it would really help if you have an appraiser that may not be familiar with this little enclave or little development or subdivision, and they have these types of rights. You need to make sure they understand that. Fourth, that which is immovable by law. I've asked a lot of people over the years what it is, and I think it varies by state by state. And in this new edition, on the paragraph on page 22, he talks about that. It's often found in your local state civil or business code. Such items are part of the real estate, whether or not they meet the strict requirements of permanent attachment. And we'll have to leave it at that. It doesn't usually come up in standard residential real estate appraisal, but when you get into commercial work or development work or court work or eminent domain, these rights can often pop up, and you'll have to further your education in these rights. And as well, if you're going to court, of course, you have an attorney that you're working with, and they will be able to explain that. And that will be just one more thing you would have to add to the appraisal problem. Next slide, please. Okay, test for fixtures. Well, he has a nice little way of remembering with the Maria here, a method of annexation, adaptability of the object, relationship of the parties, intent of the parties, and agreement of the parties. It helps you determine for an appraisal or a sale which objects are included or excluded. Now, this is not super difficult. It gets that way sometimes if you're getting to the commercial realm, but most of what we do here is going to be talking about residential homes. So here is my explanation and example if you're testing for a fixture. We're talking now about homes in the, and I know a lot of you outside of California are going to laugh, but we're talking about the typical home. It's probably in the $300,000 to $600,000 bracket. Let's say you have a home that does not have air conditioning. So in California, Southern California, in the flatlands, I should say, in August it gets very hot. And I think everybody would agree that when you are very hot and sticky and the temperatures are in 90s or hundreds, sleeping is often difficult. So your house was built without air conditioning and nobody ever bothered to add it. So you go down to your local store, your big box retailer, and you pick up an air conditioner. Now, the older buildings, older homes in the core areas of many cities were built in the 40s and 50s, and they're still there. And they were built well, that's why they're still there. And a lot of them have windows that go up and down. Even the newer ones have aluminum or dual pane windows that are double hung. So you have a part at the top can come down, part of the window at the bottom can come up. And in the old days, that was your air conditioning. If you had a breeze of some sort at night, you opened your windows. People don't like to do that anymore. So you go down to your big box retailer and you buy yourself an air conditioner and you take it in your bedroom and you open up your window and you set the air conditioner in the window, and some of them still have the flaps that you pull out, and then you close the window onto your air conditioner and plug it into the wall, and you have a beautiful cool air to cool your bedroom at night. You may have 2 or 3 of these in the house, and it provides air conditioning where needed and as needed. Well, that's great, and it works, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. So you sell the house. Now, you haven't had the house very long. The air conditioner maybe is only 2 or 3 years old. So when you get ready to move, you go into your bedroom, you unplug your air conditioner, you pull up the window, you take the air conditioner out, and you pack it up, and you take it to your next residence, and close the window, and everything is fine. That is not a permanently affixed to the property, and it is a fixture. And if you have window air conditioners and you're selling it or listing it, you have to let the people know whether or not that air conditioner, that window air conditioner, that personal property air conditioner is going to go with the house. So we have the method of annexation. It was just set in the window. The adaptability of the object, well, adapted just fine. It's not uncommon in many areas. The relationship of the parties, well, now you're talking about a sale, so you need to know what's the intent of the parties involved in a transaction with a window air conditioner, and then there has to be an agreement somewhere along the line about whether that window air conditioner goes along with the property when it's sold, or whether the sellers are taking it with them. So that's a test for a fixture, and I think it's a pretty good example. It served me well and my students for several years, and maybe we'll have to change it one of these days, but for now, let's go to the next slide. Well, real property rights. This should be a review for those of you who have had basic real estate principles, and so we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. These are definitional types, and you will see them again in some type of an examination, quiz, etc. And we want to know now that fee ownership is the highest form of ownership in real property. It's referred to depending on who's writing it, whether it's fee simple, or fee simple absolute estate. Absolute means you have everything. You would have, from the core of the earth on up. Doesn't really happen too much anymore. The oil companies very often have the right of your fossil fuels underneath your property below a certain depth, etc., etc. We don't want to get into all the details of this because it's not pertinent in this class, but suffice it to say that the fee simple is most of what you're appraising with single family residential properties. Now, if the property is leased, we'll get into that in the next few slides, but for right now, fee ownership means that you have the entire bundle of rights, and you need to read a title report in California Other places have different types of names for them, but a title report will give you anything that is different or will show you if somebody else owns one of the bundle of rights on your property. Next slide, please. Well, wonder of wonders, here we are. We've come up on the bundle of rights. We always refer to it sort of like a bundle of sticks, and that's fine. That's a good illustration. I don't have a problem with that. And so here they are. Let's review them. The right to occupy the property. Okay. If you have it, let's say, let's keep it simple again. You have a house. You have the right to occupy it. You have the right to sell it. You have the right to borrow against it, to put a mortgage in California or some other trust deed or whatever jurisdiction you're in. You have the right to exclude others from it. You really do, even if you have to call the police. And you have the right to convey ownership by gift or inheritance. And that is very important. The reason that was put in many years ago, I don't know exactly when this became codified, but a lot of big estates and a lot of very wealthy people gifted or their children inherited the property, and it was important to the people who owned the property at the time that they have the right to convey ownership by a gift or by inheritance. Next slide, please. Well, let's talk about partial interest. The owner of the property may keep some, and he may sell or lease other interests to somebody else. And this comes about when the bundle of rights or the interest in the property are split. And there's two that are the most common, and it happens in residential real estate just as well as it does in commercial. The landlord may decide to retain ownership of a property and give up the right of occupancy in return for rent or a contract or a lease. They're all the same thing. This is called a lease fee estate of the landlord and a leasehold estate by the tenant. Now, the other thing that can be given away, these are all on page 26, and you should review them because you're going to see them again, and be warned. If the owner of the property gives away the right to will the property to somebody on their death, then a life estate and a remainder estate are created. It's quite well explained in the book, and it's certainly explained well enough for this class. But the owner of the property will have the right to live in the property during their lifetime. And upon the death of the person, it will be going to someone else called the remainder man, because the law is generally sexist. It will be called a remainder estate. And these are specialty type of appraisals, and you can find them sometimes. You can call attorneys, you can look for grant deeds and so on. It's more difficult finding comparables than it is if you're doing straight on leased property. You can mortgage a property in California, take a first deed of trust, whatever you wish to call it, but I'm going to stick with the word mortgage. The owner of the property retains an equity interest, and then there is a debt or mortgage interest that the bank or mortgage company or whatever has in the property. Debt and equity. There's an undivided interest in common areas. We'll talk about condominiums in chapter 17. Some of the things that we commonly find in partial interest are the ones I mentioned here on this slide. Another one that's not mentioned here is a timeshare. The timeshare is the right of occupancy of a unit, for lack of a better word, often in vacation spots. You have the right to occupy it on a certain date for a certain price. So on a timeshare, you may go and decide that you love Hawaii. You're going to go to Hawaii every winter. If you live up in the mountains like I do and there's lots of snow and you're not a skier, so you can buy 2 weeks from January 10 to January 24th in a certain unit, and for that 2 weeks of the year it will be yours. And this became very popular about 35 years ago. And of course then management companies came up with this, and now you can join a certain group of people, and you can swap your 2 weeks in Hawaii for 2 weeks in Hong Kong or 2 weeks in Australia, and you become members of this particular area. And of course they're of this type of organization, and of course there are fees, but it works out much better that way, because you may decide after a few years that you're tired of going to the same place in Hawaii every year. So now you have the choice of going to a lot of different places. So that's cool. A cooperative is a stock option company that builds a residential, usually, not always, but usually like an apartment complex. And if you own stock in the company, then you can own a certain unit. Now, that's a lousy definition probably, and I will quite frankly have no problem admitting that anybody from New York that appraises property in New York can tell you more about cooperative properties than I will ever be able to do so. They're very rare in California. There are 2 or 3 cooperatives in Long Beach. Most of them have not sold in a long period of time, and what is selling is of course the stock in a way. And for a long time, and still in Southern California, it's very difficult to find out financing for a cooperative because it's just not commonly done. Back east in New York, it's very common. I have had the privilege of talking to some residential appraisers at meetings over the years, and they deal with it on a regular basis, but we don't deal with it out here very often. Again, you come into a competency rule. If you're asked to appraise a cooperative, list it or sell it, make sure you talk to somebody that knows the ins and outs of doing that, because you will get in trouble if you don't. Ownership subject to a financial obligation, and that's usually a lease and or a mortgage. And number 9 on page 26 is air rights. I wouldn't worry about air rights for a minute. They have to do with usually building high-rise office buildings downtown. They can be transferred. There are places like in Chicago where there's a building built over a railroad easement and things like that. They get very complicated and are well outside the scope that we're going to deal with here in this basic real estate appraisal course. So let's go to the next slide. Well, we're talking about categories of use restrictions. Ownership rights can be limited or restricted. It shows the poor property owner there in this little graphic with the private and government and market restrictions holding him down. And first thing we're going to talk about in this is the government restrictions, and we'll go to the next slide to do that. Well, government restrictions are delineated below by Pete, our favorite buddy for government restrictions. P stands for the police power, E for eminent domain, T for taxation, and E for escheat. These are the 4 powers that government has. Police power refers to government regulations and so on, not necessarily the policeman on the corner. Eminent domain, of course, refers to the government taking private property in return for remuneration, in terms for money. Taxation deals with, well, you know what taxation is, and escheat deals with properties when there is no heir and somebody dies, then the government will cheat you out of your property. Next slide, please. Well, there are a lot of government restrictions shown on pages 29 and 30 of your textbook, but we're not going to go into all of those. Some of them get very complicated. If you have questions on all that list on page 29 and 30, and I don't talk about it in this course, and it's a thing that you'd like to know more about and get started, I'll point you in the right direction, and you can go ahead and educate yourself. Some of these, of course, would be like subdivisions and so on. These come and go in California, and of course it requires that we have available land. Other things like environmental controls and historical preservation, some of this stuff we're not going to get into in any detail, but if you have questions on it, just email me through Canvas, and I'll be glad to point you in the right direction or give you what I know about the subject. First thing we're talking about here on Pete is police power. Building and safety, general welfare, community planning, zoning, and so on. If you're an appraiser in a city area, or any place really, but especially in a county area like Los Angeles, which has 88 incorporated communities, and some communities that have not incorporated and are still in Los Angeles County, or Orange, or San Bernardino, or Ventura, whatever, you need to know about the building and safety departments, and at least once in your life you need to go down and talk to these people. If you're going to develop a piece of land, or you're going to have to build something somewhere, or somebody asks you to sell something in some place, or whatever, if that's a little out of the ordinary, you need to get down to the building and safety and talk to community planning. I know that sounds funny, but generally, building and safety is in one thing. They deal with zoning, they deal with permits, and community planning will also deal with zoning, but it is under building and safety, it's the use of the zoning, but under community planning is what they're going to allow to be in those particular pieces of property and the zoning. And these get updated on a regular basis. They can be changed. I'll give you a quick example is that in Los Angeles, the R4 used to allow 1 unit per every 400 square feet of site. R3 allowed 1 unit for every 1,200 feet of site. Now there were other restrictions there too, but I don't want to get into that. All I'm saying is that one allowed much denser development than the other one, and this was determined by the community planning board, and the zoning not only was it designated R4 for the high density, even an R5, but they had a lot of other restrictions. And now in the wonderful days of the internet, you can go to almost any city, get their zoning, see what their requirements are, and get an idea of whether your property is legal or legal non-conforming. It was grandfathered in. If you're going to be a developer or you're going to build something, it's very important that you become good buddies with the people in community planning. Now, under eminent domain, it was the idea of the sovereign body, the king, if you wish, or the government nowadays, taking back private property for public use and paying just compensations, part of the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. A lot of talk on Facebook about who knows the Constitution, and I would like to say that it's probably not too many people who've actually read it or read it many years ago. So before making comments about what the Constitution says, it's always a good idea to read it. And of course, then the Supreme Court has something to be said about all the amendments, and so you have to, it can be very complicated. In this class, we're just going to talk about the fact that the government can take property and pay just compensation. Seems simple. For those of you in California or those of you who travel a lot, you know that the Interstate 5 freeway goes from San Diego to Seattle. Now, prior to whenever that was built, it had to be somewhere in the 60s because Eisenhower started all this in the 50s. This road goes right up through farmland, it goes through cities, it goes through a lot of things, and all of that land was privately owned at the time, and it had to be taken by the process of condemnation, which is the process of using eminent domain. So eminent domain and condemnation are hand in hand. One is the statute, one is the method or the use of doing that. Now, most people, these easements for freeways were made in earlier times, were paid quite well for their property. And there's been a lot of change since people built the freeways. But in the days of redevelopment agencies in the state of California and other states in the Union, eminent domain was used to take private property. The property was then given or contracted to a private developer who built retail shopping centers so that the city could get higher tax income. I know it's simplified and so on, and there's other things going on, but we're not in a law class and we're not going to sit here and educate this thing. Well, there was a lot of backlash in some states. I believe back in Connecticut, where the Coast Guard Academy was, the government wanted to take 110 homes for a new shopping center or whatever it was some years ago, and 7 of the people were attorneys and didn't want that to happen. There was a huge lawsuit, and the outcome was that they kept their property. Now in California, the governor, because of the budget situation in California, took all the funds out of the local redevelopment agencies, and so eminent domain for development in Southern California has just about stopped. It has to be private now, or banking, or whatever, or corporate, but the redevelopment agencies are no longer. So if you're asked to do an appraisal and the client calls you up and says, the state's taking my property and they said I could get an appraisal of the property, they would pay for it, which they will. If you want to do that type of work, as always, when competency comes into play, find somebody who's familiar with doing appraisals for eminent domain and get some help, and it can be a good segment of the industry to work with. It depends. Eminent domain right now in the Central Valley of California has been occurring because of the high-speed rail. All those road beds and everything have to be acquired by the state. So it can be a very interesting field in which to work. Next slide, please. Well, this slide on government restrictions won't take very long. Taxation is pretty well known by everybody. Taxation rates in California for property are totally different than any other state in the Union. So I guess I should give you just a little bit of history, because it is getting to be ancient history now for those of you who are probably taking this class. In most places in the 49 states of the United States, the property is appraised by the assessor, the county assessor or whatever, and the values are established. And then a tax rate is set up by the city council, the county supervisors, or whatever they're called, parishes in some parts in the south. And property taxes are determined at a rate, a tax rate, a mill rate. There's all kinds of little things going on there that you don't have to know for this class, but you'll run into, so you'll know that they have something to do with taxation. In California in 1973, taxes were going up. Properties along the coast and so on were just, the properties were rising fast. Taxes were getting so high, people were losing their homes. Taxes were increasing far in excess of the wages that the people had. You can imagine, I had an opportunity to talk to some broker who had worked in the Hermosa Beach, Manhattan Beach area since the 1940s. After the war, some people settled in the flatlands, but nobody built up on the hill because it was all sandy and windy and, you know, had a lot of ocean salt and so on. And who in the world would want to pay money to look at the ocean? And so these properties were not even hardly desirable and sold slowly. But of course, now as of 2015, some of the sites are worth millions of dollars. And if the taxes went up that much and you were living there after being a GI from World War II, and even if you made a decent living, you couldn't pay the property taxes. Howard Jarvis and his group, Howard is passed on, but his group remains, started a huge referendum to get taxation changed in California. 1975, 78, they finally got every tax parcel in the state of California set back to, I believe, it was the tax rate of 73.75. I know I benefited from that when I was living in the city of Downey. I had bought a house in 1973 for $30,000 plus or minus, and my taxes were very low. And anyway, the Harvard amendment called Proposition 13 stated that property taxes on homes could not go up more than 2% a year. So if you were only paying $100 a month, $100 a year in taxes, they went up to $102 the next year, et cetera, et cetera. This was a wonderful thing for people who were retiring. A lot of these people were vets from World War II, and you know, it was a great thing. Well, it applied both to residential and commercial properties. And of course, since the government now could not just raise taxes on property, or counties couldn't up the tax rates and so on, they had to look at their budgets and where the monies were coming from. So by now, the law states that if you buy a property in someplace and you have the sales price was $400,000, and then you're going to have to pay property taxes based on the tax rate set up for that county, and they can't be higher than 2% plus an bonded indebtedness. So if the county has mortgages or has bonds out, they have to be able to pay those and so on. So generally, tax rates in California are somewhere at 1.025, 1.03%, and they can only go up at 2% a year. Now, when you sell that property and somebody else buys that property 10 years from now for $600,000, then the property taxes go up based on the sale price. So as long as people have their property, their home, in a county in California, the taxes will only go up at 2% per year. Okay? So hopefully that keeps up with inflation, and hopefully it keeps up with your income. So that's how taxation works in California. If you're taking this course outside of California, you know probably already that there's a big difference. But if you're doing this in California to take your broker's exam, that's how taxation works. You can look up Proposition 13 in Wikipedia to get the details, and you can also, I'm sure Harvard Jarvis has a whole entire proposition on their website. The last thing we're going to talk about on this slide is this cheat. The sovereign body will take back the title to the property if the owner dies or disappears and leaves no relatives or heirs. We don't say heirs. I don't know why. In the Spanish language, of course, we don't pronounce the H. But for some reason or other, this goes back to the Latin, where I guess they didn't have H's either. So it's heirs. And so if you have a property and you own a property, make sure that you have a trust, a will, or some other document that is legal, so they know what to do with the property when you go. And since we all go, we all need to have a last testament, will, or some sort of document. Next slide, please. Well, the second set of restrictions are private restrictions in the textbook. In the textbook, excuse me if my pronunciation gets a little sloppy at times. I try not to do that. But private restrictions affect everybody who owns or lives in a, well, yes, lives in a condominium. Under CC&Rs, which are condition, covenants, and restrictions. So we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but in condominiums, you own the airspace, plus a divided interest in the remainder. So if there are 10 condominiums in this little building, you own one of the airspace units. You also own 10% of the parking structure, 10% of the parking, 10% of the pool, 10% of the barbecue pits, etc., etc., etc. And there are going to be CC&Rs, and there is going to be a homeowners association associated with that. Now, there are interesting things here. We're just going to discuss a little bit about the CC&Rs that deal with appraisers. This does not deal with the appraisal of a development of a condominium. And you need to talk to somebody who's familiar with doing that, because there's a lot of ins and outs of development of condominium, residential airspace condominiums. Okay? So, one of the things you do when you're appraising a condominium in California, in Los Angeles County, Orange County, is that the public records or the records within the city, in the building and safety, are going to give you the area inside of the condominium. Generally, condominiums are not measured. You're going to only appraise the square footage of a condominium is the airspace inside of the walls. And it can be very difficult to see how that was calculated. Okay? Most appraisers take the public records, especially in Los Angeles County, which has the best county records generally almost in the state of California. So if your comps have 1,800 square feet and your subject property is listed as 1,800 feet, it's probably a good comp. The other problem is you're not going to be able to measure the other condominiums, even if you wanted to. Can't get access. Remember, it's on the inside. So we take that. The other things you have to worry about is the restrictions on colors. In many cases, you can't, if you're an old timer, you can't put a clothesline up on your balcony. You can't paint your unit a different color on the outside, which would be difficult, but you know, things like that. So if you buy a condominium, sell, or broker a condominium, you really need to have a working knowledge of the CC&Rs. Now, just for the heck of it, on the other side of the fence, let's say you buy a condominium in a 200 condominium development. There's a homeowners association and they meet, and I am telling you, after almost 30 years of teaching this class and seeing and talking to people who have been living in the condominiums and have had problems with leaking roofs, with earthquake damage, etc., 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 you need to belong to the homeowners association. Well, you do, but you need to attend the meetings and become involved in it, because you're paying out X amount of dollars every month. If you're in a condominium and you're on the top floor and the roof leaks, you don't call the roofer, you call the association. They get the roofer out and it fixed. You don't pay for, you pay for that in your homeowners association, so on. So fees, there were some really interesting things back in the 80s and 90s with earthquakes and subsidence and poor development, et cetera, and some of these condominiums still having problems. So condominiums, you got to be very careful when you're selling them or if you're buying one of them. Now, use restrictions that are recorded in the county, and title companies who sell title insurance to buyers and who will do many things for you as a sales agent and brokerage because they want your business. They want you to have your buyers use their company, their insurance company, for title reports. These are where an appraiser can find use restrictions, is in the title report. Now, if you're doing a sale as an appraiser and you're talking to you, the sales agent or the broker, it's very easy because you're going to have to get a title report to the escrow company. And nowadays, everything is done by email. The title reports are in PDF, and it's just as easy for you to email a title report to an appraiser so they get the actual what's going on than it is in the old days when that was had to be mailed, or you had to get, pick it up at the bank, et cetera, et cetera. So appraisers and sales and brokers can know now what the use restrictions are. You might have a piece of property that they put a private restriction in it that you cannot build a school on that property, and that's legal. Prior to 1954, I think it was prior to 1954, people put restrictions. Excuse me. If you find old title reports, you will find really what to us sounds very strange. There's things about national origin, about your skin color, about your religion, about your this, that, and the other thing that you can't or can or whatever buy or live on this property. These were all eradicated by the Supreme Court in 1954. You'll see some of this in the old movies about restricted areas. No longer. But you can put legitimate legal use restrictions on your property. It may affect the value. I've heard apocryphal reports or, gossip and so on that there were properties on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles where commercial buildings were not allowed for a certain period of time. So you need to know those kind of things when you're working in particular areas. And in California and in Southern California, which I know more about, it's easy now to get a title report on any sale property. If you have you're doing an appraisal of a refi or something like that for appraisers that may take this class, then you can ask the owner of the property for their copy, which was given to them when they purchased the property. And they can give you a copy and you can read it over. View easements are, again, in areas like the coastal areas of California, lake areas all across the nation, mountain views or anything like that, which is considered to be valuable to a particular property. You can have a view easement. And there are not a lot of those. I know of one property here in Big Bear Lake that had a beautiful view of the lake. It was only a one-story. It was up on a little hill above the road that runs along the lake. Somebody bought the lot in front of them, had a small house on it. They tore it down and put up a 3-story house. Now this property across the street doesn't have a view. Well, I don't know if anything ever came about in litigation. I don't know if there were any view easements. I doubt it. And so these are the situations that can really affect the value of the property. Leases may only allow a specified use. Your unit in the small strip shopping center may only allow office use. Does not allow use of selling hot dogs. Nobody has any video store, well, a few video stores left, but that type of thing. It's a use, specified use in the lease. And if you do that, then they have the right to, evict you and throw you out and get another tenant in there. Many leases that in small shopping centers will have a, say, well, for the lack of a better, have a Mexican restaurant. There'll be some place that will sell, maybe even a pharmacy. There's a few independent pharmacies left, not many of them. And the lease will say, if you have a little hardware store, that you're not allowed to sell pharmaceuticals, or you're not allowed to sell tacos or whatever. So leases are very specific as to their use and non-compete clauses and so on which you'll get into if you get into the commercial sales and brokerage business. You'll also have a lot of training courses there, and you'll be working with some senior people that will get you up to speed on that. Mortgages may limit uses. This is not as common, especially in residential mortgages. They figure it's going to be occupied by one person. You could have a mortgage, though, where the private restriction was it was limited to the occupancy of one family of no more than 4 to 6 people. I have seen that in very limited situations. Next slide, please. Well, market restrictions, market in quotation marks, can really affect a value of the property. And what we're doing here between the government, private, and market restrictions is sort of setting a basis for the highest and best use of a piece of property, is if it were vacant and if it is improved. Economic influences are very much a factor in the development and appraisal and the selling of some properties. Some properties were just built in the wrong place. They don't do well. People don't come to that area. They don't pay the rents, or they pay rents far below others in more prime areas that have better economic influences. There used to be the old joke is that nobody ever buys pizza on the way to work, so you put a donut shop on the way to work for the mainstream of the people, and you put your pizza parlor on the other side when they come home. But you think about that, it's simplistic, but it's true. You find cleaners. You drop off your clothes in the morning maybe, or the night before, and you pick them up on the next night. How things are and where they're located is really important to the valuation of the property. Feasibility, what use is in demand and short supply. There are some places, and I've been told that Houston, for instance, Texas, does not have any zoning. It's all done by highest and best use, or they limit things. If you have a shopping center, you want to build a shopping center on a commercial area, and they don't want you to, they'll give you one access curb cut. So you can't get anybody in and out. And so it becomes not feasible to develop. Things like that. But feasibility in Southern California is what use is in demand or in short supply. This happened in the 70s and 80s when all the strip shopping centers you drive by every day of your life, if you drive in Los Angeles off the freeways, you see all these. They were developed because what was on that corner lot was not up to the highest and best use. It was the equivalent to land value. They bought land value and put these strip shopping centers in. There's some of them that are, 4, 5, 6 units. Some of them have an L-shaped. But, open your eyes, you'll see all these things. But is there a demand now for more? Maybe in some areas. Is there something that's a short supply? Is there a short supply in warehousing? Well, probably not right now. During a recession, everything retracts in. And feasibility is real difficult, and you don't see a lot of development going on. But is there a demand for more houses? Is there a demand for low-income housing? Is there a demand for low-income apartment housing? These are the things you need to find out if you're going to be a developer, because this is what determines the value of land if it's vacant. Pursue a rezone to allow another use, economic incentive. Well, this has been rewritten a little bit here, and it's a good way of looking at it. Very often, areas will change, and residential areas, apartment areas, can go either way. You can have properties that are, like we were talking about in R3 and R4, they're R3, and they don't have very many apartments on it, which happened in 1985 in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles, where they had 6 units on a property that could take, believe it or not, 40 units, 2 stories over grade level parking. And they were tearing these down, and they were developing to their highest and best use. Some of them needed to be changed to R4, and they did that. They pursued the rezone from R3 to R4 to allow a higher density. That's an economic incentive You buy the property, develop more units, you get more money. Okay. Potential uses and value on page 31, essentially summarized here in these two sentences. Consider all restrictions to identify how land can be used. It's vital to pricing and valuation. If you have something there and for whatever reason, in some cases in zoning it's burned down and it can't be rebuilt, then you have to think about what you're going to do in the future with that property in order to make it feasible and productive. Next slide, please. On this slide, we're just finishing up restrictions, and that's good. This summarizes it very well. I've alluded to the fact that the market encourages only those uses of land that are economically feasible. And so the combination there determines how land will be used, and it is the basis for our discussion in the future of highest and best use, which is the most important principle in real estate appraisal, maybe even brokerage to a certain degree, certainly is in development. So I'll say once again, the most important principle in real estate appraisal is the principles of highest and best use. Of course, you will see this again. Well, that's the end of this particular section. Let's go to the next slide, please. Well, in Chapter 2, we're on Section 2.3, Property Descriptions, and I really like this part of the course. It's fun. It gets away from some of the theoretical. We can see what we're talking about, and we start to do a little bit of mapping and so on, and talking about surveys and so on, and it's really pretty cool. I think you'll enjoy this. Of course, the downside for the student is that there's a lot of things to remember, and there's, of course, if it's hard to remember, it's good to test on, right? So anyway, let's take a look at what we have here. There are three types of legal descriptions we're going to be talking about. It starts on page 32 of the textbook, and we're going to go through those. You can fill in all the details with your reading of the textbook and have the lesson. But let's talk about the recorded lot, block, and tract, meets and bounds, and the government survey. And by the way, down here in red it says the assessor parcel number is not equal to the legal description. That is certainly true in California. I can't speak for the other 49 states, but the assessor parcel number is the tax ID number in many states. It also has some other names, which is fine, but it is not a legal description. Many appraisers will ask you as sales or brokers for an APN number in order to locate the property on a map. Legal descriptions can be very long and are usually is the reason why an appraiser asks for a title report, because it has the correct, or should have the correct, legal descriptions. I did find a industrial condominium one time that had been mislabeled in the title report, and it drove everybody nuts for a while until they got it all straightened out with the title company, because nobody wanted to believe the appraiser could count from A, B, C, and D. Little 4 unit, they had reversed the order in which the units were numbered in the legal description, and it got all straightened out. It was not a big deal, but it was the only time in my career that I have seen that. So let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about the recorded lot, block, and tract. This is what's most common now in California in development. You, as a developer, and as the broker that may be helping the developer, or you may be the developer, and or you may be going to sell the homes after they're built. So, your consortium gets together and buys 40 acres of land. It's going to be out in the Inland Empire or Ventura or someplace around, probably not in Los Angeles. Can you find 40 acres without tearing something down? So let's just move out a little farther east into San Bernardino or Riverside counties. You bought your 40 acres. You've looked at your number of homes that are available for sale, and you find there's very little for sale. You're finding that more people are coming out at that You do your highest and best in your feasibility studies. You find out these people are making, well, you know, it depends. If they're making $40,000 to $50,000, you can't build them $500,000, $600,000 homes. If they're making $150,000 to $200,000 a year, then you can figure that you could build homes. So this is part of what the feasibility analysis is in highest and best use. Seeing what you can build that will sell. So first off, you're working with an architect or a surveyor, and the surveyor goes out and marks the property lines, and you tell them how many lots you want. So it's like this little example down here on a real small scale of 6 lots. And the surveyor and or the architect are working together will have a tract map which is temporary, and it will be submitted to the government agency overseeing your property, whether it's a county supervisors or a city community planning department. And they will look over all this, so on, and finally record your map if everything is approved. There's a lot of stuff going on here, folks, that you're going to learn when you do this. I'm just skipping the highlights. So you're going to get a plat map for this little 6-home subdivision, or 60-home or 600-home subdivision. It's it's just a matter of scale. And they're going to assign to you a tract number. They're going to assign you a block number, and lots will be numbered. Okay? So in this case, the arrow is pointing at lot 3, block 4 of Nottingham Forest, a subdivision recorded in volume 138, page 1 of the map records of Harris County, Texas. Okay, that's how Harris County, Texas does it. That's fine. You'll find many of the old tracts in downtown Los Angeles were named after the original owners or named after the original business. The blacksmith, Wolf's Blacksmith tract, things like that. And so farms and dairies in Los Angeles go back into the end of the 19th century, in the 1890s and 95, when some of these parcels were first developed. So this is how you get a recorded lot, block, and tract map. When it's recorded, it's recorded as an appraiser, then you can value it. If it's a tentative tract map, you cannot value it because it is not for sure. I have seen that in my career where banks who were unsophisticated loaned money based on a tentative tract map where they were going to build 22 homes, and in reality, when the fallout occurred and all the sadness came about when they could only build 6 homes on those 6 assessors' parcel numbers. So, appraisers only appraise development properties for financing if there is a registered and recorded tract map. Enough said on that situation. Next slide, please. Here's a subdivision map. It's an example. You can find it on page 33. Sad to say that there's a lot of stuff on there. You're going to need your magnifying glass and or bring it up. You can do a certain amount of that, but it's not really important that you read all the details, but you can see that this subdivision map. Now there's some interesting things here that just more as an appraiser rather than a sales or broker, take a look at this map here. Would you entertain an idea that those lots in the middle of this map are on a hillside? Could be, right? There's not a lot of buildable area. They're long and narrow and so on. Down below off a street you have lots, and above it you have a street with lots, and you can see on the east, which is always on the right side of a map in the United States, you can see the lots are a little bit longer, so you figure this may be a hilly area. And of course, if you knew where it was and you were familiar with it, you know that it is hilly, and you start to get some ideas by looking at maps, especially subdivision maps or plat maps. You can see on the upper right hand corner here the subdivision maps 4847. It'll give you the county and all that kind of good stuff, so you know where it is if you're dealing with a map of this type. Let's go to the next slide. Meets and bounds, an early example, has been around forever. This was the way that early surveyors or people delineated their property, and it was very common in the 13 colonies of the United States. We started over here at the point of the beginning at Joe's barn. We walked 100 paces toward the old hickory stump on the ridge, then toward the Widow Jones's cabin for a bit, then past the old flour mill and back to Joe's barn to close the meets and bounds. Well, it doesn't take much imagination to see the problems with that. The stump got pulled out or washed away. Widow Jones left. The other one burned down. The flour mill is no longer used, et cetera, et cetera. And so, but these is an actual early example of meets and bounds. And we'll talk a little bit more about this here when we get to the next slide. So let's go. Next slide, please. This is a classic meets and bounds map. It's used for irregular properties. It has a call, the angle, and number of degrees. They can work with properties that are very irregular. Some of them even have arcs in them, where they're circular. And so, as you will see in the next few slides, the government survey is mainly in rectangles or squares, but when you have really strange shaped properties and you need to have a legal description, you use the meets and bounds. This is described to you on page 34 and 35, has a lot of good information in it. You can see where they start, the point of the beginning, and they come around and it has to close. One of the things about this is that you can find an officer at most title companies that can determine the area enclosed by this property. Some counties will tell you what it is. In this case, you can see that it's parcel B has 3.18 acres. Others are not so lucky. Also, if you're really interested and you're looking on figure 2.5 on page 34, you can see the old-fashioned meets and bounds description with the old English writing, and it's a very useful tool. And it's something that you're going to run into as a sales agent, broker, and as an appraiser. Next slide, please. Just for the fun of it, I spotted this actual legal description a few years ago and put it in my archives for use for the course. And it reads as follows: the west 175 feet of that portion of the southwest quarter of the southwest quarter of the southwest quarter of section 27, township 4 south, range 10 west, San Bernardino Basin meridian, lying south and west of track 2212 in the city of Garden Grove, county of Orange, state of California, as shown on a map thereof recorded in book 63, pages 45 and 46 of miscellaneous maps, records of said Orange County. Wow. Couple of things you could notice, remembering that the San Bernardino Meridian, so in Township 4 South, so it's what, 24 miles south of the Meridian, and 10 times 6, 60 miles west of San Bernardino Base, and it's next to a track, and we know it's in Garden Grove, county of Orange, which is a city in the county of Orange. And so I'll tell you what, let's go to the next slide and I'll show you where it is. Well, here's a portion of the plat map of the previous meets and bounds legal description. Now, for those of you who might be really new to this, I'll give you a little bit more. There's West Avenue in the corner of West and Chapman, and it's in Garden Grove, obviously. And when you've seen plat maps like this, it's obvious that that little cul-de-sac street has homes built either side of it. There's another street there, and we don't know how far the track goes because it's not a complete map. But the corner property there, and I surmise, I'm not positive, I didn't drive down and photograph it and so on because it's more fun just to talk about it, but it's very likely that this was the homestead or the family farm and the house and barn and so on of a farm that was there in years past, and they sold off all of the land except for that corner parcel, and it was subdivided into small lots and homes built on it. So I don't know if that's true, but that is the true meets and bounds legal description for that corner lot in Garden Grove. You can use that to practice and see where it is if you wish. Next slide, please. Well, here's our government survey. Most of the land in the United States outside the 13 original colonies were surveyed in this manner. The main thing you need to know, well, there's a lot of things you're going to need to know about the government survey, but for the testing purposes and so on, everything is limited to California, and these diagrams have been out for a long time. They're still very accurate, and we have to start someplace when you're doing a survey of a property, which means that you need to see have some place to start to see how big a property is. Of course, now GPS is very accurate and it's a lot used. In fact, some of the old maps were found to be inaccurate when GPS came out, especially the very accurate GPS signal that they have now. But in reality, there are markers, heavy bronze markers put into granite or something that's not expected to move in any time soon, and there is 3 of them. Okay, now I'm in Southern California, so I'm very interested in the San Bernardino meridian and baseline. If you live in the San Francisco area, you're very interested in the baseline of Mount Diablo meridian, and of course if you're up in Northern California, the Humboldt meridian and baseline is very important. And of course all these things have a great affinity for turning up in examinations. The points there at Humboldt, Mount Diablo, and San Bernardino are called initial points. Got that? Got that memorized? Okay, a couple other things. Remember that the meridian goes north and south, and the baseline goes east and west. And by the time we get through the next 3 or 4 slides, if I tell you and give you a legal description based on the government survey, you'll be able to give me a pretty good idea of where the property is located. Next slide, please. Well, here's our government survey. It's a start. Look in the middle there. You can look it on page 37 in your textbook if you can't see it as well on this on the PowerPoint. And you can see where the initial point is. We got a principal meridian going north and south, and we have a baseline going east and west. And then we developed a township survey every 6 miles. And the naming is pretty easy. It's not a big deal. I mean, ranges go east and townships go north and south. And so naturally they, named it Township 1 North and Range 1 East and so on. So it wasn't, whatever. Very easy to do. And each one is 6 miles, so you have, 36 square miles. And some of you know where we're headed with this. And for those of you who don't, we'll go to the next slide. Well, here's a township. We don't know which one, but we don't care. It's 6 miles and 6 miles, so there's 36 miles. And we designated that each square mile was a section, and each section generally has 640 acres. Now we have a square rectangular map here, and we're slapping it onto a curved spherical earth, and so each section does not necessarily have 640 acres. It could have a little less, a little more. So we say generally has 640 acres. Okay, for calculations, we'll take the 640 acres, but you're going to find a quiz or something, as I remember, in your course that says that they always have, and of course you know, especially when you're doing true and false, that always is always false. But anyway, here we go, and so we number these sections, and we start up here on the upper right hand side inside the lined square, and we go to the left with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, which indicates to me that the person who did this, the surveyor who did this, is left-handed. There could be other reasons, of course, but when you number from right to left, it makes you think you're left-handed, or maybe some of the Asian languages and Arabic languages are written from right to left. So who knows? Maybe he just liked to do it that way. We don't know. I have never studied that history. I just always thought it was interesting to note that the numbers went from right to left rather than from left to right. Not a big deal, but then we have section numbers and we have township and range numbers. So we're getting there, pretty close. Let's go to the next slide. Well, we need to break this down a little bit further. We have a section here before us. You can turn the page in your textbook if you're following along that way. Page 39. And you can see that we have 1 square mile. And we can see how long a mile is. Of course, you all remember that from elementary school, right? That a mile has 5,280 linear feet, not square feet. And a section, therefore, is 5,280 feet on each side. Now, for those of you who are interested, which may be none of you or maybe some of you, you'll notice on the illustration on page 39 that a half a mile is 2,640 feet, which all of you did in your head anyway. It's also 40 chains, which is the old way of surveying. They actually had a chain. You can look up and see that 20 chains on the top up there, on the top line, on the right-hand side of the right-hand square, that 40 chains is 160 rods, or half of 40 chains is 80 rods. I'm sorry. 40 chains is 80 rods, and half of that would be 20 chains. They put all those numbers in there, and I shouldn't make those kind of mistakes anymore, but I just did. Now, if you'll take a look at the bottom of 39, you'll see that a legal description can be applied, or even on the slide here, the west half of the northeast quarter of section whatever. Take a look at this map on the government survey principles. There's a square. They drew 2 lines through the median of each side and top, and now we have 4 squares. Okay, on the bottom part of the illustration, we have 2 large squares, and they are a half of 640, which is 320, which is 160 acres, which was a homestead in the old days. So each one of those big squares at the bottom has 160 acres, as you can read. If we take the upper left, which is the northwest quarter of the section, you can see that it was divided into 3 parcels. Okay? The north half of the northwest quarter. Now, how you figure out something like this on an exam is that you draw it. You're going to have paper or draw it on whatever you want to. This is an online course, so nobody's going to look. If you've got the paper out, so you have 160 acres in the northwest corner of this section. Half of that is 80 acres, so that long parcel on the north is going to be 80 acres, and the other 2 are going to be 40 acres each. Okay? Now on the northeast, they made it just a little bit more complicated. They took one section, the west half of the northeast section, and it is 80 acres. They have a 40-acre parcel on the southeast corner of the northeast corner of the section. See how I'm doing this? And then that 40 acres was divided into 4 parcels. One of them is 20 acres, and then they have 10 acres and 2 fives. So you can imagine how they do that. Okay? You have to think about it. And when you see this on an exam, draw it out. And remember, they're just named by the coordinates north, south, east, and west. When you divide the section into quarters, you have the northwest quarter on the upper left, northeast quarter on the upper right, southwest corner on the lower left, and the southeast corner on the lower right. Now let's make it just a little more complicated. Let's take the northwest quarter here, or on the, upper left. Now you have the what? You have on that left 40 acres, you have the southwest quarter of the northwest quarter of the section. On the 80 acres, you have the north half of the northwest quarter for 80 acres, and so on and so on. So you read legal descriptions of the government survey backwards. You find the section, and then you draw the quarter, and then you draw the next quarter, and whatever it records to get it done right. Practice it a little bit, and you'll see what I mean. Next slide, please. Well, here we are on contracts, section 2.4, and we're going to talk a little bit about that to wrap up the chapter 2. We're not going into great detail. When they updated the 9th edition, they cut out a lot of the other stuff they had, but I would read it through because as a sales agent or a broker, your contracts are very, very, very important and determine what's to be done, how it's supposed to be done, what the price is, and so on. And these are the contracts that you will be held to if by some unfortunate reason this stuff goes to court. So, a contract is defined as an agreement between 2 or more persons which creates an obligation. That's the important part, the obligation to do or not to do a particular act. That comes out of Black's Law. The essential elements of the contract are the offer and the acceptance. When an offer is accepted, then we have a situation where we're getting ready to go to escrow. Next slide, please. This slide just talks about the importance of contracts in terms of the contract you have when you list a property, the sales contract you write up when there's offer has been accepted. The leases and rental agreements become contracts as well. Many brokers and sales agents work as representatives of tenants or representatives of landlords, and so there are agreements that have to be written up there. Financing, of course, has lots of contracts. Most of us are familiar with that. And then, of course, for your sales agents and brokers and even appraisers, you need to know what the private restrictions are on the property. Next slide, please. Well, there are requirements to have a valid contract. You can find these on page 41. One of the things you have to have is competent parties. There was an interesting question some years ago by a broker who wrote a lot in the LA Times, has passed on, but he had a property. He said there was a property that was gifted by an uncle to a niece, in this case, who was 16 years old, and she owned it and was the owner of record of the property, but she could own the property, but she could not sell it without the having a judge say it was okay and everything was good in case somebody was trying to take advantage of her and so on. So she as a minor, was not competent to buy or sell properties, but in the case she was able to sell it as an to receive it as an inheritance and own the property, and when she became of age, then she could be considered competent and sell the property. The subject is an act to be performed. The contract has to be, the rules and items in the contract need to be performed. There's the legal consideration, making sure it's the right property, the legal description and everything else. And then there has to be a meeting of the minds, a mutual obligation or agreement that the contract is good for both sides, and there is an obligation in a contract that both parties will comply with the requirements of the contract. So that's pretty easy. Well, here we are at the end of chapter 2. You should have learned about real estate versus real property. Real estate equals physical object, and real property equals the rights of ownership. Unfortunately, we use it interchangeably quite often. Personal property and tests to determine if it's a fixture, our friend Maria. And real property rights, bundle of rights and restrictions on those rights. The 3 types of legal descriptions. And with a little work and a little homework, you're going to be able to figure out where something is based on or how big something is based on the government survey. And we had a couple slides on contracts. But if you're a sales agent and you're active, and of course if you're also a broker, then you probably know more about that than I do. So we'll leave it at that. We added that because it was required. The contract section was asked for by the state of California. And those of you who have taken real estate principles, appraisal, and are working as sales agents and brokers, I'm sure you have enough information for your knowledge of contracts. Next slide, please. This slide has your alphabetically first important terms and concepts. Use this for review. You should know what these are and how they're used. Any of these important terms and concepts are great fodder for doing true and false questions, even on midterms and finals. So go over those, know what you're getting into, and go to the next slide. Here's the last slide, or the second slide, on important terms and concepts. Again, the same thing applies. Look these over, become familiar with them, and be ready to see or be tested on these things. So take care. Let's go to the next slide. I can't tell you how important it is, or I need to impress upon you how important it is that you pick your subject property this week and email me the address. Read the practical applications at the end of chapter 2. It'll give you some other ideas, help you out. You can use a hypothetical condition if you have other problems. And if you're having problems that can't be solved by this section, then email me and tell me what's going on. Really appreciate that. Take care. We'll see you in chapter 3.